My name is Tania Rodriguez, and I am a first-year psychology student in the PhD program at UCR, more specifically in the developmental psychology program. And my research focuses on low-income minority older adults and helping them increase their cognitive and functional abilities via engagement in learning new skills to prevent or even reverse cognitive decline.
All right, and I'm Leah Ferguson. I'm also a first-year graduate student in the developmental psychology area at UCR, also in the Calla Lab, which is looking at like cognitive aging and learning across the lifespan. Our interests are pretty aligned, Tania and I, but I'm leaning more into learning based off of necessity. So we have some overlap there if you picture a Venn diagram, but I'm also interested in other underserved communities or marginalized communities, like returning citizens from being institutionalized, people with disabilities, and how learning out of necessity affects cognition, improving it, how it affects cognitive load, that kind of stuff. Additionally, in our lab in general, we do more neuroscience stuff. So we look at the brain and EEG brain waves and how attention is affected by categorization and how people find what they're looking for and how that might inform learning research. So yeah, we do a lot in our lab. And our main advisor, the main person in charge of the lab is Rachel Wu, who started all of this. So we can talk more about her as well.
So I'm curious, Tania mentioned that you're sort of under the umbrella of developmental psychology. And I feel like developmental psychology focuses a lot, and this could just be the layperson's view, focuses a lot on how children develop, because obviously the brains are so malleable at that time. So they do a lot of focus on that. But it's interesting. It sounds like you're working with adults already, or do you mix it all? How do the age groups match up at your lab?
Yeah, so you're right. A lot of the developmental area focuses on infancy and childhood and how we develop as children. So the aspect that I'm focusing on is the cognitive development and decline across the human lifespan, with a particular focus on older adults. And actually, the principal investigator of the lab, Dr. Rachel Wu, as Leah mentioned, applies this idea that the same components that help children learn during their childhood can also benefit learning in older adulthood. So we're applying the research with children to older adults in the area of learning.
Is the matchup in what you've seen so far, either what you've studied or what you've researched yourself, do the same things that work for kids in approaching new things, learning things, and holding on to those things in their brain, do those exact same strategies map over to adults and older adults, or are there things where some things seem to work for kids and they don't work for older people?
Right. So one thing that comes to mind is in that research, like children is usually new things. They're not relying so much on prior knowledge because everything that's incoming is pretty new, right?
Right.
And when it comes to older adults, they have a lot of previous knowledge. So a lot of the things that they do on a daily basis, so things that they learn, they base it on the previous knowledge that they have already acquired. So one thing that we can think of when it comes to learning is that a lot of the same things do apply to older adults. The main thing here is that there's a stigma that older adults can't learn new skills, that they're too old to learn something new.
Right.
Which is a pure stigma, because very feasible, especially like with the research in the lab that has been done with learning interventions, it has shown that it's very feasible to learn new abilities, but we still need those same components that we would need as if we were children. So for example, having an environment that allows you to make mistakes instead of putting that whole pressure of you need to be perfect, being able to be flexible, right, with learning and being encouraged to learn new skills. Usually with children, you always like, oh yeah, you need to learn new skills and you need to learn how to do this and you need to learn how to do that. And you're very encouraging towards like children.
Yeah.
But when it comes to older adults, it's like, oh, well, you should already know whatever you need in life. You should have already acquired the skills that you need. But that's not necessarily true, right? Especially when it comes to older adults who maybe still be working, they need to learn technology as it advances and things like that. And it also helps their cognitive abilities. So I think it's super important to stay cognitively engaged and stimulate our brains to make new neural connections, and use that as a way to boost our cognitive growth and boost our functional abilities as well.
I find it so interesting, those things you mentioned that help kids also help adults, and the fact that now you're saying kind of cultural in their context, not talking about an ethnic culture or a national culture, but saying in the context of their lives, those things could totally be lacking, or they could tell themselves that they're lacking. I mean, they could tell themselves they can't learn anything new and tell themselves it's all on them. Do you feel like the things you're studying, what do you hope happens with the research? Because I feel like some of it could be systemic. It could kind of tell employers and tell society in general, or tell people who care for older people, these people are capable of learning things, and you could adjust their mindsets. Or is it a lot of trying to adjust the individual learner's mindset if they're being held back either by the things around them or their own thinking about it?
I think that it's both, right?
Okay.
So starting with like the individual themselves, trying to help them realize you can learn new skills if you set your mind to it. You're not too old to learn new skills. And you mentioned like mindset, right? So having a growth mindset and believing in your self abilities, versus that fixed mindset of, oh, I can't learn this. So starting there, and also motivating them to learn new abilities, and by basing it on their interests, whether it be, like Leah said, out of necessity or out of fun. They have to be abilities that are somehow challenging to them, that pose a challenge on their brain, right? To be able to be cognitively stimulating, but also giving them that self-belief in their abilities, and also like pushing towards society to have more opportunities for older adults to engage in novel skill learning, and encouraging them and kind of getting rid of this stereotype that they can't learn new abilities. So increasing more opportunities for them that are accessible. In particular, my focus is minorities, so racial and ethnic minority individuals with low income. And you need money many times to learn new skills, and you need access to certain tools. So another big aspect of what my research is trying to do as big impact is providing more free resources for minority, low-income, older adults, so that they're able to take these opportunities and actually engage in learning new abilities.
Do you find that if I feel like there's economic classes and racial groups, and sometimes they cross over economically and sometimes they don't. Do you find if you're looking at people who may be of lower means, do you find there's differences depending on their ethnic culture they grew up with about their approach to these learning new things? Or does it feel like sort of the economic circumstances make them all together in one group? So kind of when you look at these marginalized groups, are they split up in your head, or they kind of all fall into this umbrella of people struggling in one way or another economically?
Right. So in my head, and the way I look at it in my research, is this overlap between low income and being a racial and ethnic minority.
Okay.
Because a large amount, like a large group of the population who are low income belongs to the minority group. So I'm doing the overlap.
Okay.
But when it comes to specifically just being low income, or specifically being a minority, I feel that the biggest piece of being low income is having that lack of financial stability to be able to buy the tools that you might need for learning new skills. And if you have a cognitive load already, or like this stress of, I need to pay the bills, I need to put food on my table, you're not really going to be thinking about, I need to learn new skills. Right?
Right.
It's going to take up that cognitive space already with what you're dealing with and the stressors you're dealing with on your daily life. And then the aspect of being a minority, I feel that there is some differences, right, between being, let's say, a white older adult versus a Black or Latinx older adult, because of the discrimination and the stereotypes. Since there are studies that have shown that in school, the teachers themselves can have a bias towards Latinx or Black students, and impose that, they're probably not good at math, or they're probably not good at doing this. And they themselves kind of internalize this biases that they're getting from their own teachers. So there's a lot of stigma around just being a minority on its own that might make them feel like less able to learn new abilities, in comparison to other racial groups.
Is there any way, I feel like it gets, an argument that doesn't hold a lot of sway with me, but may or may not. So there have been a number of people who talk about the Black American community and say, well, this is a cultural problem, that we aren't making as much money, that we don't do as well. And I think the argument against that is the economic argument that if you have a group of people who historically in a certain company who may or may not in a country look a certain way, but they've also been economically underprivileged and discriminated against because of the people outside that group, like it all gets complicated in there. Do you deal with any of that in there, trying to tease out, are there cultural values these people have inside the context of how they grew up and who they grew up with versus just outside forces? So in other words, kind of criticizing that argument, we hear sometimes from inside and outside communities that, well, this is an internal problem. We don't value education. We don't say we can do this. That's the problem.
Yes, I think very much is this historically, discrimination and racism that has been going on that causes systemic issues and gives them this problem of lack of access to resources. And for example, we cannot blame them or say oh, well, why don't you look for more health opportunities?
Right. Well, people can blame them, but they shouldn't.
Shouldn't. Exactly. We shouldn't. Because if we think of healthcare access and how that's very limited for them, how's that on them, right? And overall, promoting higher education, for example, which can be another factor to protect against cognitive decline in older adulthood. Promoting higher education is not as promoted with minority populations. I myself am Latina, right? And I didn't know a lot of things about higher education. If it wasn't for several mentors in my life that helped me get to where I am today, I wouldn't have known anything. And just the other day, I think it was actually yesterday, I was talking to another Latino student, and he had no idea what it meant to be a PhD student or to get higher education or how to get there. So he didn't even know if he could even apply to a graduate program or what it's required, because it's not as promoted for some reason among minority populations. So I very much think it's really a systemic issue, and the same racism or discrimination that happens when it comes to accessing resources, it's coming from the people outside and rearing those stereotypes into the group. And sometimes internalizing happens where we kind of build this self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's where the issue lies the most, and not so much of, oh, well, it's because they don't think they can do it, that's why they don't do it. I think it's not promoted or encouraged enough to make them believe in themselves that they can do it, or provide them with the resources that they would need to help them get to where they want to be.
If you're looking at, if maybe you can tell me more about the exact kind of research you're doing, what it looks like, the kind of modalities you use, because I'm curious about if you identify whether there are physical things that happen to the brain at an early age if you're discouraged that make it harder to learn something later. So are there physical elements, genetic elements, societal elements, and then most importantly, sort of individual psychological things? Is it ever possible to tease that all out?
Yes. So in my particular research run, I haven't been able to run any participants. As I said, I'm a first-year student still in the works, but it would consist of low-income minority older adults. And one of my first studies is going to focus on identifying those psychological and physical barriers to learning new skills, which can entail anything from just outside lack of resources like transportation, having a lower education, having access to healthcare, their financial resources, and things like that. So those are very outside forces, right, that might be in the way of learning new skills. And the psychological barriers that come with that, like motivation, having a lack of motivation or having a very fixed mindset of, oh, I can't learn new abilities, and just having overall a lack of self-belief in their own abilities. So those are the kinds of barriers that I'm trying to look at. I'm not doing much work with genetic type of situations or not
Sure.
much biology in there, but definitely what are the forces driving them to learn or not learn new skills. And then the goal of that first study of just, it's going to be interviewing minority older adults who have a low income to try and get more at what are the barriers that maybe we're not perceiving, but they are perceiving for themselves when it comes to learning something new, and what are the kind of skills that they would be interested in learning. And based on this information that we plan on collecting, then we can create a learning intervention that's going to be fitted for them, because it's not the same as creating a learning intervention that is for white older adults who have a higher income because they have more resources, and maybe they're more likely to be retired. They have the opportunity to be retired in comparison to maybe a minority older adult who has low income and needs to still make money to provide food on the table.
Is there one of looking at how different cultures or different families talk about education and consider it a possibility or not. There's some families and that did not go to college. They don't see necessarily the value of learning things because they struggle economically. Things are very utilitarian. And I feel like there is a privilege that comes with people who are middle class and up, where it's easier to say, well, learning for learning's sake, educating yourself because it's interesting, making yourself a more well-rounded person. When you look at your research, are you thinking mostly about kind of utilitarian economic ways in which people are learning skills for the workforce, or that people in general could be more successful because they kind of learn that learning itself can be fun, learning itself can broaden your horizons, whatever that, vague term means?
Right. I think that for my research, what I'm going to encounter, it's learning out of necessity as well. Especially for example, Latinx minority older adults who maybe don't know how to speak English. That might be one thing that could come up, right? Like, oh, well, I would want to learn how to speak English.
Right.
But they maybe can't because they're working the entire day and they don't have the tools to be able to find like a class or something that helps them learn English with their schedule that they have, something flexible. So I feel like it's going to be a lot of it out of necessity.
Yeah.
Because that's the first thing that might come to their minds. If learning something new might be, well, I need to learn English because this will help me in my current job, or it will help me get on another position somewhere else. So, but then we're also looking at maybe what are their interests of learning new skills. Maybe they would love to learn how to paint, and that's something that they've always wanted to do, but they just haven't had the time and haven't had the tools or the instructors to teach them how to do that. So I think there's going to be a bit of both aspects of learning out of necessity for utility purposes and learning out of fun for pure interest.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to add here to the conversation that like learning is 100% a privilege, right? There are so many people across the world that aren't provided the opportunity to just go to school in a structured format that we see in many westernized cultures. But it's a necessary privilege, right? Because we learn, yes, how to be a part of our thinking of proper words here, how to be a part of our honestly capitalist society, right? We learn the things we need to learn to be a part of the workforce. But we also learn really vital socialization skills as children. We learn give and take. We learn this is mine, this is yours, oh, let's share. And as we get older, because our research does focus on older adults, we lose that socialization as well. Think about once you retire or once you hit a certain age, if you aren't living in a intergenerational household or multi-generational household, maybe you're living by yourself and your partner dies at 85, 80 years old or younger. And it's really isolating. And our research really looks at, as we get older and as we lose or remove ourselves maybe from opportunities that provide variety and novelty, even if it's socialization, what is that doing to our cognition as we age? Because as a society, as Western society, we expect to lose our cognitive capacities as we age.
Right.
And the point of our research is to challenge that. Why is that the norm? Is that the norm? Is that what our bodies like naturally should be doing? Or is this a outcome of how our society is kind of structured? And, our research is challenging that. We're seeing huge cognitive improvements and huge jumps in functional independence in our participants who are a part of our learning interventions. And we're seeing also that aside from the executive function improvements, so the memory capacity and the inhibition and kind of like prioritizing tasks that we have them complete, we're also seeing improvements in like their overall well-being and growth mindset. And that carries on for years when we follow up with these participants. So we're seeing, changes in the brain's abilities to do things, which was a question you asked earlier. But we're also seeing changes in just their overall perspective of their capabilities. And with Tania's route, with trying to increase the access of these opportunities with her research, we're hoping to carry that over into wealthy, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic sort of populations, those weird populations that most psychology research and STEM research is on. And we're hoping to branch out and provide those opportunities to people who aren't necessarily the focus of research, even though they should be included at the table, in these conversations. There was another point I wanted to add. So because our research is on older adults, I'm trying to answer some questions that I wanted to answer previously.
Yeah, absolutely.
We haven't looked too much into the like actually doing MRI or fMRI scans. We did once, but it's really expensive. And with older adults, there's some limitations. So if anyone has an implant, like a heart, like a pacemaker or anything like that, they can't do fMRI. So it's really challenging to find participants. But there is a huge growing body of research on Black and Latinx youth into adolescence, into young adulthood, and the impacts that discrimination, racism, economic, systemic processes have on children's abilities to learn and continue to learn, and the impacts it has on their telomeres. So like a really deep biological impact. It's literally shortening their lifespan. And it's also, some of Tania's research also looks at allostatic load. So it's affecting their just ability to, and Tania said this earlier, prioritize things that as a white person, we can prioritize, right? Like, learning for the sake of learning. Like we have that privilege, but other people don't. And constantly being thrown with like microaggressions or macroaggressions affects the cognitive abilities to kind of switch between learning for the sake of learning and I need to make money and put food on the table for my family, because that's what I'm struggling with right now, because systemically right now I'm not being supported in the capacity I should. So there are definitely a ton of barriers to the research. And with aging research and with working with older adults, unfortunately, we're kind of at the tail end of that. But we're hoping that through our research and like spreading the word that we can kind of move it towards a preventative measure and work with younger adults or like middle-aged adults to kind of prevent the decline in cognition and functional independence as they age. Okay, that's it. I hope I clarified some things there, and I want Tania to add as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Leah. I'll add on to what she said because it reminded me of this other piece of information. So like she said, there's a lot of stress that happens throughout their lifetime due to inequalities that they experience and disadvantage that they experience. And there's actually a framework by Forrester and colleagues that was published in 2019, which is called the Minority Stress Framework. And this framework kind of helps explain the current disparities in cognitive and functional health that exist among minorities, because we do see that Latinx and Black individuals, for example, are at higher risk of cognitive decline. So that's what we're trying to get at, decreasing also that disparity through learning new skills. If we can get them to engage in novel skill learning and provide them with the resources that they need, maybe that can be a way to lower that disparity that is currently in place because of that lifetime of inequality and disadvantage that they experience.
So I sort of, obviously within and outside of these communities, sometimes there's some individual blaming of either the collective or the individuals inside that community and saying, this is your fault. I cannot think, well, I'm sure I could think of other groups who get more blame and who society is actually focused on inflicting pain, shame, guilt, and making them suffer as prisoners in the federal and state and local prison system. Could you talk a little bit about, so I think the sensitivity to all kinds of people in normal life, even people who are not like you, really gets scratched to zero when it comes to convicts. So maybe Leah, you could talk a little bit about what kind of research you've done about recidivism in prisoners. The big fear is always, well, we lock you up. When you come out, you commit crimes again. And obviously there's a perfectly reasonable argument. Well, they went in there because of a life that led to this, and nothing in prison allows them to break out of that. And so when they come out, of course, they return to it. So tell me what kind of research or what kind of things you've looked at when it comes to the learning by people before they wind up in prison, and then the learning available to them in prison, and then what, actually can happen when they come out. I know that's a huge thing, but I know you've looked at recidivism, so I'm super curious, because I think that group in general, I think America is very much focused on punishing people who've broken the law and not so much about, there are other countries that are much better about helping people change when they get out. And I don't think America is probably very good at that.
Yeah. Our system is not built on rehabilitation. It's built on punishment and not necessarily punishing people for crimes they committed. So we could get really political with this conversation. The gist of and these are my views and backed by science as well and research, but not supported by everyone. Okay. But our prison system is really unethical and punishes people in extreme ways and people who are already systemically disadvantaged. So specifically people of color and people with low income or highly impoverished communities. In terms of recidivism, it's just a cycle. So I'm sure you've heard of the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
And Tania, alluded to this earlier, or, straight up said it actually, is that teachers have biases. And those biases affect how students perceive themselves and perceive their capabilities as human beings, right? So if teachers are conveying this bias of, and there's been plenty of research on this as well, like as a Black student, teachers are looking for troublemakers, quote unquote, in Black students. They pay more attention to students who are Black and discipline them more harshly for smaller things than they do white peers. And there have been some longitudinal studies on the impact, many actually, that this has, and it has been deemed the school to prison pipeline, where this ongoing, continuous micro and macro aggressions towards students of color has on the communities and also the individual. And so if you are constantly being told that you are nothing but trouble, that you are constantly getting in trouble for things that are really small, if you feel like you do not belong in a space and you're being told that or shown that over and over and over again, you're going to start believing it. You're going to start internalizing that. And if people around you who look like you are also experiencing the same things, that's a like community narrative that you're being told by people who have a lot more privilege than you. And if you're constantly being pushed down or pulled down, or like told that you can't do things, it can really affect your feelings of like self-efficacy, right? And what you can do. And we throw around the term resilience a lot as a culture in the United States. And resilience can be a protective factor, but it's also just kind of a necessity in some communities, to where if you want to see a change, like if your parents are telling you, you have to go to school, I'm doing all these things so that you can have a better life than we had, then you have to kind of be resilient because you have people backing you up. But imagine you don't have anyone around you, or your parents go to prison, or your brother goes to prison, or your sister goes to prison, and all of your friends are going to prison. And you're just kind of in that community out of necessity, out of protection, and part of a culture that necessarily you didn't choose as a community, as a people, as a person. Then it's just kind of inevitable. And our system is designed to do that. It's designed to keep people down. And there are some wonderful programs that are trying to change that, or trying to help people once they get out of prison.
Yeah.
And with COVID, there's actually been a huge wave of long-term stay or sentencing individuals who are getting out during COVID. And they've been in prison for 30, 40, 50 years. And so in terms of the learning research, we're seeing a huge shift in kind of these people's like economic, trying to think of the right words for this, their economic standing, right? Because they've been in prison since like 1980, and now it's 2020. Technology has changed drastically. The way the world and workforce works has changed drastically. Maybe the community that they grew up in has changed drastically. Expectations for people have changed drastically. And now you're, 50 or 60 years old, and you have a stigma of being imprisoned for whatever your sentencing was for. And maybe you're a person of color, and your family doesn't have money to support you, or your parents are gone, and you don't have children. And so all of these things are stacking and stacking and stacking. And there's been a few publications during the pandemic that have come out on how people are coping or how people are finding jobs during the pandemic. And, it was all over the news that people who are disadvantaged were the ones who were forced to keep working during like 2020, and also the people who were dying from COVID the most because they didn't have the ability to stay home. And so there's a lot of overlap in like older adult marginalized communities, like we were talking about earlier in learning, and
like the ones in prison as well, the numbers
exactly.
of older convicts, because again, as COVID popped up, America cared the least about prisons. I mean, who cares? They're convicts, so we don't need to worry about PPE. We don't need to worry about quarantine care. Yeah. And
there, our prison systems are already highly impacted. They're over, So many inmates died during, and are still dying because they aren't able to get vaccinated. Our prison system is majority privatized now, unfortunately, as well. So there's a huge like systemic issue there that is in need of drastic change and overhaul, along with a lot of other things in our country. But and I don't have the answers to those. But,
okay, I was going to ask this one. I mean, obviously the ex-convict situation is so much rougher than a person who fits into society but is poor, or fits into society of a marginalized community, but they're still having the added thing of running through the criminal justice system and then having all the things that come out after that, having your freedom taken away. So this is very dark. So we can't talk about, we can't give them any painting. I mean, so the kind of trauma that happens to you in a community where you feel like you kind of don't have anything open to you. So crime is the best way to make money. The crime is the best way to help your family. Crime is the only, or you see or nihilism. There's no point to this. I can't make anything of myself anyway, so I might as well have fun while I'm here. Then they get into the system, and then that's traumatizing. So you got these two periods of trauma, and then they come out and then there's the extra abuse of people are suspicious of me. There are specifically laws preventing me from getting certain jobs, and certainly companies don't want to hire me. There's like no end to this. And I understand that even if a person committed a terrible crime, there's no end to this punishment, and mercy and justice are supposed to sort of be evenly balanced, and it's heavy on the justice and not so much on the mercy for this person who is supposedly, now they are free. So they have been freed. They're on parole, or they've fully done their sentence. Now they can re-enter society. What is their psychology like? And what is the hope? They're learning how they get back in. I don't know.
Yeah. So
you don't have to answer it, because obviously, no. But I don't know. Yeah.
I do have like some anecdotal. I interviewed family members and individuals who, family members of previously incarcerated individuals, and also like those previously incarcerated individuals themselves. Obviously, incarcerated individuals are a protected community. In research, they don't have rights, so to speak. They don't have rights, essentially. They don't have the right to consent on their own. Like, there's a process of permissions, basically, if you want to work with those. And I did this research as an undergraduate, so I did not have the means to get those permissions, but there are wonderful people doing research right now, and lots of dissertations, for example, that have looked at this. But
as in they do not have the right to tell you can gather information from them. You have to get it from some authority. You
have to get permission from the prison first. Okay. And then
even after they're out, if there's
no.
Okay, we're talking about prisoner. Okay,
yeah, like like actively incarcerated. But post incarceration, like they can give their own consent. So that's the information I have. So so there's a lot you have to deal with. One, families of incarcerated individuals. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you have to support your family member while they're incarcerated. Anything that, like, you have to send them money to buy things, to buy food, to buy clothes, to buy toothpaste and toothbrushes and stuff like that. If you are able to do that as a family, that's great, but that's a huge financial burden on top of legal fees and any other fees that you have to pay. So some of that is rolling over as people are released. You don't get that money back. The money that you send to your family member when they're incarcerated, like, if there's money left over, you don't get to walk out with that in your pocket. That's now the prison's money, first of all. So there's a huge financial burden while the family member is in prison. And then when they come out, like you said, there's a huge stigma against people with a record, essentially. No matter what the crime was, and you apply for a job, they ask if you have a felony, and you're supposed to be honest about that. But when you are honest about that, you face discrimination, and even though they can say it's for another reason, right? Sure. But so some people have that I spoke with did link up with nonprofits, or found a mentor who was able to kind of help them figure out their next steps. So one person that I spoke with for a very long time, they got out of prison. I think they spent 10 years in prison for drunk driving, or drugged driving. They were under the influence of multiple things. And they went to prison for a long time for that. And when they came out, they worked with some nonprofits, and eventually went and got their degree as a social worker, and are now working with the people who went through the same thing that he went through, to kind of try and boost them. So there are individuals who have experienced the same thing and are kind of taking on mentorship roles, or are taking on mentorship roles, not kind of, they are, and they're working with nonprofits to kind of reduce the cycle, right, of kind of like helplessness and feeling like your own country isn't there to support you, because it's not. And we're a very individualized nation overall, so you kind of just have to figure it out on your own. So there are individuals and nonprofits who are there to support you. There are federal programs, to help you get on your feet, but they have a very long wait list. They're hugely underserved and underfunded, and they aren't able to provide quality assistance. Same thing with finding a job and stuff like that. So
even if somebody gets out and they want to try, so let's say they've got the right mindset, they've got that resilient mindset, they're full of grit, they want to turn things around, they feel some hope, that doesn't mean that they can get into any of these programs that can help them.
Yeah. And even if they want to go to school, like they have their high school diploma, you can go to college in prison. Your options are limited. Usually it's just fulfilling like general ed fulfillments, and you can continue that, but usually they're private schools that are, offering this to inmates, and then when they get out, they're hoping that they'll send them tons of money and become students again. Okay. But and sometimes they're community colleges that are there. So it really depends on what part of the country you're in, what the prison is, like how the system's. There's no consistency, is the point. There are a decent amount now of scholarships that students can apply for if they want to go to undergrad. You can apply for scholarships as a, I'm trying to think of the term that UCR uses for the scholarship, but I can't remember it. So, but basically, if you were previously incarcerated and you're now wanting to go to school, there are scholarships for that, and those are great. But if you think of this, the ratio of people who probably want to go to college and can afford it and need those scholarships compared to the availability of those scholarships, it's disproportionate. But so there are systems in place. Some of them are better than others, but because the systems are limited, it's hard. It's really hard. And I think that's where the overlap is with Tania and I's research, is that there are so many barriers that you have to break through, and you can start with 1,000 people in front of one barrier, and then as you picture people going over the barriers and overcoming them and overcoming them and overcoming them, once you reach that finish line, let's say getting a PhD and becoming a professor, there's 1 or 2 people out of thousands. So that's like this, people just fall through because they aren't supported along the way, because we don't have systems in place to help people and to support them, because you have to figure it out on your own. Or in academia, it's not very diverse. So you don't have the mentorship and the representability, like to say like, oh my gosh, like I have my mentor who's in this place and they did it, and there's so many other people who are like that, like I can do that too. So there's a whole issue of being represented in an area where you'd like to be as well. So it's all very idealistic, and when you break it down, there's a ton of barriers that I think researchers want to have answers to, and maybe they do have answers, but then it's a matter of funding, and the government has to be willing to do it too, and working with policymakers, and that's a whole nother hurdle.
I mean, again, as a layperson, so I haven't studied it closely, but looking out at the common culture and having read for many years, looking at America's treatment of people through the prison system, just as you've said, we are a very individualized country as opposed to collectivist. We do not take responsibility for the people who commit a crime. So you have the freedom to do whatever you want, hypothetically, if you have all the means you need. And then if you choose to commit a crime, that was your choice. And now if we catch you and we can convict you, we're going to send you to prison. Your whole life in prison also financially sounds like, well, that's a responsibility of you and your family to figure that out. And then when you get out, well, that's a responsibility of you and your family to figure that all out. And maybe that works on an individual blame level. So we feel good because a person has taken, quote unquote, responsibility for their choices. But as far as good for a community who comes out and then maybe has nothing else to do, but again, commit crimes or whatever it is, it just doesn't seem like a good collectivist idea, but I don't know.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify that not everyone who is sent to prison has actually committed a crime as well. And that's another topic.
No, I'm sure everyone in jail and prison who's been convicted of anything, they all did what the prosecutor, the judge, and the cop said they did. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. That's definitely true. Okay,
right. Yeah, exactly. So, but let's not, I don't, and we won't get into that too much.
Yeah, forget on wrongful conviction, as you pointed out, the differences between, depending on how much money you have or not, whether a thing you get is a felony or a misdemeanor, or you simply don't go to jail at all for it, is often a matter of money. It's where you live. It's how much money you have. It's the people you know. That determines whether you get a felony or you get nothing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. So
wait, so you made me feel really bad. Come on, where is the hope? So we're thinking about neuroplasticity of people who have had their brains absolutely squished by the system and poverty and whatever, role models around them throughout their life. And then they pop out the other side. They live through prison. Where is the hope? What do we hope for them when it comes to learning about being able to take their life in a different way and being supported to do that?
Yeah, so that's definitely more leaning into sociology,
right.
Which I also very much like, but I haven't had the opportunity to work with many sociologists right now. But in terms of what we hope with our research, it is a matter of hope, right? We want to spread the word that this picture of aging that we have, where you slowly forget things over time, like dementia kicks in, or you can't remember things, and you lose your ability to really function on your own, and you rely on many people around you. It's not, and the people living to be 105 and like are living life like they're still 55 or 60, those are rare, right? Those are special cases, but it really shouldn't be. We have the blue zones, and Loma Linda out here in Southern California is one of those. And so there's several blue zones where these like rare populations of people living to be exceptionally old in our standards, right? Over 100 years old. And cognitively healthy, right? They're independent like families or partners or whatever, and they're living on their own. They're still cooking their own meals. They're running and biking and all of these things. We don't deal with the physical side of things too much, but in terms of cognition, like, you shouldn't be afraid of losing your functional abilities as a human being when you hit 80, 85, or 90, 95. Those are things that you can maintain and even continue to improve when you get older. And that's what our research is. We aren't looking at maintenance of your cognitive capacities when you hit 65. We're improving cognitive capacities. People who start in our program and or our research that we published, right now, has shown that by the end of our intervention, people have improved to the baseline cognitive abilities of that of like a 30 or 40-year-old. And the average age and baseline of our participants was about 80 years old. We are in the process of publishing findings that have found that a year later, they're continuing to improve their functional capacities and are on par with our baseline measures of like 20-year-olds. So people are improving by like 40, 50, 60 years. It's not across the board, these are averages, but their cognitive abilities are continuing to improve just by challenging themselves for 12 weeks to learn something new. And we don't focus on mastery. We aren't testing them. They aren't getting graded. It's about having, like Tania mentioned, a forgiving environment, a supportive environment, one that works with you to foster really empowerment and confidence in yourself, and just trying to challenge yourself to learn something new, whether it's painting, whether it's a new language, even using an iPad, composing music. We have worked with that. And so like you can improve your cognition, and you can improve how your brain functions when you're 65, 75, 85, 95, 105 years old. So that's our message.
Okay. So I love that, because that kind of leads me to sort of kind of an overarching question that I wanted to be sure I asked, which was the difference between kind of fact acquisition and retention, and then sort of utilitarian skill learning. But kind of what you're talking about there is, when you're judging their learning, are you largely judging whether they kept up with it and if they felt good about it? Because to me, again, the way I grew up, it's kind of learning for learning's sake. It's fun, so you like to do it, and they're nice benefits, but you're not learning because you need these 10 facts, you need to hold on to them. You're learning because learning is fun, and it makes your life better overall. Kind of like a glow of being curious about things is wonderful if you have the time and the right mindset. Is that what you're kind of judging, the mindset, or are you really kind of have some practical things you lock into? Because I like just the fact that they felt better after this period. Or how do you judge that how do you judge their learning? Is it based on their subjective answers, or are you really trying to look for objective things?
So I mean, these are classrooms. We create classrooms, and the teachers give homework and stuff. They aren't necessarily like graded. They receive like feedback and everything. Yeah. And we do have like a beginning of class, like, where are you guys at? Like if they're learning Spanish, for example, how do they answer these 10 questions? And then at the end, they get the same 10 questions. And how do they answer these in Spanish? And so we do have markers of improvement, but we aren't sending people home with like an A+ and stuff like that. If they're learning painting, we have them paint the same picture on the first day of class that they paint on the last day of class. And we have pictures of improvement. So we can do side-by-side comparisons, be like, whoa, okay, this person can paint now after 12 weeks of like 2-hour classes, once a week. So we do have markers of improvement, but we really emphasize with our participants that you get out of this what you put in terms of what you're learning. Our hope is that, you'll be happy at the end of this, because we're providing all of this to you for free, and we want you to have fun and get out of it what you want. But our main goal is to see how this affects your cognition and your executive functioning and your memory and stuff like that. So we spend a lot of time picking courses and topics that have connections with executive functioning and improvements in memory and stuff like that. So we don't just randomly pick classes. We pick ones that in the literature have been linked to improve specific cognitive functions.
So then if you checked them over the weeks, you could see that there'd been some improvement as they learned this thing they wanted to learn anyway.
Yeah. So we have cognitive assessments we run before they start the classes, the same week they start the classes. In our published literature, we do halfway through the classes, a cognitive assessment, and then right when the classes end at that 12-week mark. And then we do 3, 6, and 12-month follow-ups. So we're collecting a ton of data on the cognitive assessments. And we also collect their well-being, self-reported well-being measures, growth mindset measures, functional independence measures, we have tons of data, so much that we can't publish it all in one paper. And it takes a long time to analyze, such is the nature of research, but really exciting, positive things. The downside is the time and the accessibility and the availability to everyone. One, it's only in English, and we're in Southern California, huge diverse population that we cannot access. We don't provide transportation, just out of, it's not in our budget right now and stuff like that. So there are tons of limitations. We were doing a more diverse, larger sample of people. We had 60 people in our learning intervention, but it ended early because of COVID. So I'm hoping to bring people in to see for a cognitive assessment to compare to their before the classes started cognitive assessment, but we weren't even able to collect, right when COVID hit, like where were they at the end of this sudden shutdown, because we couldn't, and I didn't want to do it either, a 2-week lockdown, make it 6 months, I would stay home.
Exactly.
And we're working with a high risk population in general. Many of our participants already had health concerns. So, so we have their classroom markers, the teachers teach and do their regular thing, whatever they feel is best for their classroom and their students. And then we have the researcher side of things where we bring people in for their cognitive assessments and survey measures and stuff like that. So it's multi-pronged in our approach. It's very time consuming and expensive and not accessible to everyone. And that's something that we're hoping to bridge over time.
Maybe that I'd like to, because we kind of started talking about the underrepresented populations that Tania had been working with. And so Tania, I am curious, maybe this last question would be about, there's a huge kind of cottage industry growing up there about smartphone apps and web apps and all kinds of services to help people who are of means to make their brains better, so improve your neuroplasticity and make your learning better. So all those things are out there, and there's companies now making, millions and millions of dollars trying to make people.
Those aren't founded on science, by the way. They have no literature supporting them, just as a disclaimer.
Okay, so they're out there they're like the initial whatever, I don't care about them. They're kind of like snake oil. Look, it sounds good. If it makes you feel better, wonderful, but there's no proof that this works. But hey, you're making a bunch of money convincing people if you do this app once a day or twice a day or whatever, it'll make you smarter. This is more grounded stuff, and it's focused on an underrepresented population. At the end of the day, if there is science, I mean, do you ever worry like most of the stuff will just get picked up by sort of for-profit interests, or because rich people always want to be smarter and rich people always want to stay younger longer, and they have the money to spend on all the things? Or do these interventions feel like none of the interventions sound like they have to be just for the rich necessarily? A little extra money into certain populations would probably help. But I don't know. Do you ever think, the stuff's just going to get co-opted and it's going to wind up on some app someday?
Well, another thing that came to mind when you're talking about an app, we need to think about technology, and that being another barrier for low-income minority populations.
Yes.
Right? There's that digital divide going on.
Yep.
So I think that this is going to hopefully be more of a community approach, where communities themselves embed this research and have classes available for their communities, right? Especially in Spanish for Latinx older adults, and that are flexible for them to join, right? Because this intervention is not necessarily getting rid of those barriers forever for them, right? It's just during the period of the intervention, or trying to link them up to other resources. But hopefully we can make current learning programs that are aimed for older adults more aware of these barriers, so that they implement tools that help them bring in more minority low-income populations. That's the hopeful goal that would come out of this. Now, I don't know if other companies would try to implement this part of to make money or whatnot, but if they do, I hope that it still has a good outcome at the end of the day, and that they do keep in mind that they have low resources, and that they are helpful instead of, making them pay high fees or whatnot, because that would not happen. If they're low income, they're not going to pay a chunk of money to learn new abilities, because they just don't have the money to do so. So I'm hoping that the outcome is a good one.
Yeah, a lot of the conversations that happen in our lab right now amongst our PI, Rachel Liu, and us as researchers, the grad students, is the next steps and the applicability of our science. And yeah, definitely linking up with community centers, working with counties, which is something that we've been working on with our local county, and on bridging like the digital divide, and working with nonprofits are steps where that's probably where our research is heading in terms of like disseminating this information and making it accessible to everyone. There are so many more gaps to fill in, specifically with like Tania's research and stuff. And we're really excited for the next steps, but we're still kind of opening the door and dipping our toes in the water to kind of put together two very different analogies. But yeah, so I mean, we hope that no one skews our information too much, but through outreach like this and talks at aging conferences, the Gerontology Society conferences, for example, and any community events that we go to is how we share this information and make sure that it's sort of not filtered, but more or less translated into more of a lay person. Like what do you mean by cognitive functions? What do you mean by executive functionings? What are functional independent? What are these terms? So we try to make sure that we're conveying that information more plainly, like, hey, we've improved people have shown improvement in their memories and their ability to switch back and forth between tasks and stuff like that. And it doesn't apply to everyone, these are averages, but yeah, we're really hopeful, and we hope that our information never gets put into the wrong words, so to speak, to manipulate people, because that's not the basis of our science. And Dr. Rachel Liu does a great job of making sure that if people want to use this information, that it goes through us, that we see where it's going and making sure that they aren't sharing the wrong information for profit and stuff. It's solely just to share the information, and so that people can take steps on their own if they want to, if they don't have the means to come to UCR to be a part of an intervention, or it's the middle of a pandemic and they need to do things at home. So yeah.
Have either of you, so from a personal level, in doing this research and thinking about learning, has it probably made you hopeful? It sounds like it possibly has made you hopeful. Hey, when I get older, God willing, I'm older, I might not have these problems. Is there any way you learn now, or some way you think about your brain differently, or a habit you've added because of what you've learned about seeing older people sort of improve these learning outcomes?
I know for me, I've been more mindful about implementing a growth mindset of telling myself, I'm not good at this yet. Okay. With a little bit, because that's something that is really important, because challenging yourself to learn something new, you're doing okay in the beginning, and then you hit a wall. Yeah. Like 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, and be like, okay, you have to power through that. The other thing is that when I'm speaking with my parents who are in their 60s, or my grandparents who are in their 80s, you hear that like, I'm too old for that, or I don't need to know that, I'm gonna die soon anyway. And I'm like, stop. First of all, you're not allowed to die. And then second of all, like, why? And kind of like challenging them on that, on the why part, because even my sister, who's lives in San Francisco, her children are going to like a Cantonese school. And so I'm like, hey, are you gonna try and learn Cantonese and eventually Mandarin when they transition to that? She's like, no, like you lose that ability at like 2 years old. And I'm like, sister, hey, like literally the research that I do proves otherwise. Like you won't be perfect at it, but you can learn this language. Like, so really challenging people on those belief systems of I can't, or my brain can't do that. It's like, hey, neuroplasticity is definitely a thing. So just trying to affect the people around me as much as possible to challenge them a little bit in those beliefs. That's really what I've gotten most out of the research. And yeah, I mean, I'm trying to learn new things, but in a PhD program, your time is limited. But like Rachel, for example, paints, she plays piano, she's learning how to swim. She's constantly, and now she has a baby. And so she's doing this whole thing with her baby as well, learning. Her husband's German, she's learning German. So like all of these things. So she's really applying the research, right? And I mean, I hopefully Tania and I will eventually have time, if we want to do those things, and learn new things. But that's the most doable aspect for me in my daily life, is to challenge people on those belief systems.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree that what this research has done for me, same thing, trying to keep more of a growth mindset myself and be motivated to maybe later on find the time to learn new abilities. And it does give me hope. I'm like, okay, because my grandfather, I mean, he wasn't really diagnosed, but you could see like he would forget our names and he would just kind of hallucinate a little bit. And that's how he ended up passing away, unfortunately. And I've always been scared of that because I saw it with my own eyes. And this has given me hope that if I just stimulate my brain and stay cognitively engaged, I could age successfully, hopefully. And just as Leah mentioned, when I talk to my parents, I'm like, well, you should learn English. Yeah, try to learn more English, because they're Spanish speakers.
Yeah.
And I'm proud of them because they have actually done a very good job at engaging and trying to learn English, even with their very busy schedules that they have as working the whole day. So that makes me really, really happy. And also, I pass on whatever information I get whenever I can to my family members and people that I know. And it makes me happy that there's hope out there. And with something that's in a way better than maybe taking some magical pill or something like that, right? It's as easy as if we're physically, exercising, which is promoted and with research. This is the same thing, but exercising your brain. And I think it's really cool. And I hope that we find even more interesting findings and that we get to do a lot more with it.